The people who feel the most are not the ones who show it. They are the ones who learned very early that showing it was the most dangerous thing they could do. You did not become someone who hides what they feel because you were weak. You became that person because you were paying attention. You noticed what happened when you didn't hide it. And you adapted, the way any intelligent person adapts to an environment that keeps giving them the same feedback. The exhaustion you carry is not a flaw in your wiring. It is proportional to the work you are actually doing, work that most people around you are not doing and cannot see you doing, which is part of what makes it so heavy. By the end of this, you will have a different name for what you have been carrying. Not a diagnosis. Not a gift waiting to be unwrapped. Something more precise than either, and more useful than both. But first, you have to be willing to look at what was done to the part of you that felt too much for the room. You did not become someone who hides what they feel because you were weak. You became that person because you were paying close attention. You noticed what happened when you didn't hide it. You saw the look someone gave you, not hostile, just slightly confused, slightly impatient, as if you had said something in a language they were not quite fluent in. You learned to translate. You learned to summarize. You learned to hand people the condensed version of your interior experience, the version that fit the container they were holding out, and you learned to call that communication. There is a particular kind of Friday night this person knows. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. You are driving home from a party you appeared to enjoy because you did appear to enjoy it, you were present, you laughed, you made people feel good, and the moment the door closed behind you, something shifted. Not relief exactly. More like the sudden awareness of how much weight you had been carrying without noticing. And now, alone in the car, in the 20 minutes between their driveway and yours, you are processing the entire evening. Not replaying it for pleasure. Processing it, the tone of what someone said in passing, the tension you sensed before it surfaced, the moment when the conversation flattened and no one else seemed to notice. You arrive home more exhausted than you left. You have probably wondered why this happens. You have probably told yourself it is a flaw in your social wiring, something to work on, something more functional people do not experience. What you have not been told, what almost no one has told you, is that the processing is not the malfunction. The processing is evidence of what you are doing that other people are not. You are reading the room. Not metaphorically. Literally. You are taking in more signal, attending to more layers of what is actually happening in the space between people, and then doing the cognitive and emotional labor of making sense of it. The exhaustion is proportional to the work. And the work is real. What happened in that car is what this is about. Not the party. The drive home. There is a word for the experience of your internal life being calibrated differently than the people around you, and that word is not a diagnosis. It is not a flaw. But it is also not, as a certain genre of content would have you believe, simply a gift you have yet to unwrap. It is something more specific than either of those framings, and more uncomfortable than either of them would suggest. What you have been managing is not your sensitivity. It is the shame you were taught to attach to it. The difference matters because you can manage shame indefinitely. You can become very skilled at it. You can build an entire architecture of competence and practicality and affable normalcy around something that was never a problem, and you can maintain that architecture so seamlessly that the people closest to you will have no idea it exists. But the management has a cost that doesn't show on the invoice. It shows up, instead, in the chronic low-level exhaustion. In the sense that you are always slightly performing a version of yourself. In the way certain art or music or landscapes reach something in you that you immediately move to contain because you learned, somewhere, that being visibly moved is indulgent or excessive or simply too much for the room. You have been told in various ways that you are too much. Not always in those words. Sometimes in the way someone changed the subject when you went one layer deeper than the conversation was going. Sometimes in the way a parent said something like "you're so sensitive," not cruelly, just descriptively, the way you would describe a weather pattern, as if your sensitivity were a recurring inconvenience rather than a fact about how you were built. Sometimes in the quiet consensus of a group that processed at a different speed than you did, where the unspoken rule was that you met them where they were, because asking them to meet you where you were was simply not on the table. What none of those moments said out loud was, "Something is wrong with you." But you heard it anyway. And more importantly, you believed it. And more importantly still, you built your life around accommodating it. The question that has probably never been put to you directly is this. What if the thing you have been managing all these years was never the problem? What if the sensitivity itself is intact, is in fact the most alive thing about you, and what happened, what you were shaped by slowly over years, was not the sensitivity but your relationship to it? There is a difference between those two things that will take the rest of this video to properly name. Carl Jung did not write about sensitivity as a modern therapist would. He wrote about it as a geographer writes about terrain, not to fix it but to describe accurately what is actually there. His framework for understanding the inner world was built, in part, around recognizing that there is a real psychological type, not a malfunction, not a disorder, but a type with its own coherent internal logic, whose primary orientation is inward. In Psychological Types, published in 1921, Jung described what he called the introverted intuitive, the person whose attention naturally moves toward the interior world of images, impressions, and meaning. The introverted intuitive moves from image to image, chasing after every possibility in the teeming womb of the unconscious. He wrote, and what he meant was not that this person was lost or unmoored, but that they were attending to a different layer of reality than the one most social structures are designed to reward. What Jung was pointing to here is something that the language of contemporary psychology has partially absorbed but largely flattened, that the inner world is not merely a reflection of the outer one. For some people, and this is the part that tends to be omitted, the inner world is the primary one. The impressions that arrive before the logic. The sense of a room before anything has been said. The knowing that precedes the evidence. This is not mysticism. It is a perceptual style, a way of processing experience that attends to things the outer-oriented mind tends to skip past. And it is real. And it has always been real. You did not imagine it. The second thinker worth naming here is Elaine Aron, whose research beginning in the 1990s gave a more physiological grounding to what Jung described psychologically. Aron identified high sensitivity, which she called sensory processing sensitivity, not as a pathology but as a trait present in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, and present, she was careful to note, across most species with a nervous system. The highly sensitive person, Aron wrote, tends to be more aware of subtleties in the environment, and then she named the exact mechanism. A nervous system that processes incoming information more deeply than average, which means both more richness in the processing and more depletion from it. What Aron was pointing to, and what Jung from a different direction had already mapped, is that this is not a disorder of perception but a depth of it. The person who feels things more intensely does not feel incorrectly. They feel accurately, at a resolution that most of the people around them are not operating at. The problem was never the resolution. The problem, if we must call it that, was that nobody told you the resolution was real. Nobody confirmed what you were actually seeing. And in that confirmation gap, something happened. Consider what that kind of childhood feels like from the inside before it has been named, before there is any framework to put around it. You are 6 or 8 or 11 and you walk into a room where two adults are having a conversation that sounds, on the surface, completely ordinary, and you feel something wrong. Not see, feel. Some register of tension in the exchange, something unresolved beneath the words, a quality of suppressed feeling that no one is acknowledging. And the adults look at you, and they are not lying when they say everything is fine, because at the surface level from which they are speaking, it is fine. But you know it isn't. And you cannot explain how you know, which means you cannot explain why you are upset. And so the upset, which was actually a very accurate reading of the room, gets reframed as something else. As oversensitivity. As imagination. As a tendency to make things harder than they need to be. Now imagine that happening in variations for years. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Just consistently. The feedback loop is clear. What you sense does not match what is named. What you feel does not match what is acknowledged. And gradually, because you are intelligent, because you are adaptive, because you are paying close enough attention to learn the rules of the game, you begin to trust your interior experience less and the naming conventions of the room more. You begin to second-guess the signal before you report it. You begin to manage what comes through before it becomes visible to anyone else. This is the origin story. Not of sensitivity. Of the management of it. Here is where the arc of these videos usually goes and where this one will not. The moment where you are told that what you have always felt is actually your superpower, that the sensitivity is a gift, that the world needs you to stop hiding it and start sharing it. You have probably heard some version of this. It may have been genuinely comforting briefly. And then the comfort passed and the management continued because the message, however well-intended, arrived at the wrong address. The problem was never that you didn't know the sensitivity was real. The problem was that you learned to be ashamed of it before you were old enough to know shame was something you could refuse. Think about what that means structurally. Shame is not an emotion that announces itself. It does not arrive saying I am shame, and I am here to teach you that something about you is fundamentally unacceptable. It arrives as a series of small calibrations. A lowering of the voice. A careful editing of what is said and what is not. A self-monitoring so automatic that you have stopped noticing it is happening. The management does not feel like shame from the inside after enough years. Feels like maturity. It feels like social intelligence. It feels, sometimes, like a kind of dignity, the discipline not to ask the room to hold more than it can. What it actually is an accommodation to an early verdict that was never re-examined. The verdict was delivered by people who were themselves not fluent in the language of inner life. That is not an accusation. It is the most important thing to understand. The adults who shaped your relationship to your sensitivity, who implied, through their responses or their absence of them, that your depth of feeling was inconvenient, excessive, or simply incomprehensible, were not, in most cases, cruel. They were operating within their own limitations. They could not confirm your experience because they did not have access to it. And they could not say, "I don't understand what you're feeling right now," in a way that made space for the feeling, because their own formation had taught them that feelings at that intensity were not a reliable guide to reality. What was passed down to you was not malice. It was incapacity. But the effect on you was the same. You learned that the intensity of your interior experience was something to manage rather than something to trust. And then you spent the next decade or 2 decades or 3 becoming very good at the management. Each paragraph of your life written in that management. Each relationship navigated through the careful calibration of how much of yourself to show. Each creative impulse filtered through the question of whether it would be legible, whether it would land, whether you would be seen as too much. Each time you felt something arrive with unusual force, grief or beauty, or the specific ache of recognizing yourself in something, and then quietly closed the aperture. The twist is not that you should have shown more. The twist is that the management became indistinguishable from you. You cannot now simply decide to stop managing. Because you do not know, after all these years, where the management ends and you begin. Close your eyes for a moment, not literally, but follow this. You are in a conversation. Someone says something that lands harder than they know. Not a deliberate cruelty, just a careless thing, one of those moments where someone speaks without noticing that you are there at full volume receiving it. And inside you, something contracts. Something registers the impact at a resolution the other person is not aware of. And you notice yourself, this is the part, you notice yourself deciding whether to let the impact be visible. You run the calculation in under a second. You assess the room, the relationship, the probable response, the cost of being seen at that register. And then you do what you have always done, you calibrate. You release just enough to be honest and you contain the rest. And the conversation continues. And later, alone, you feel the full weight of what you absorbed in that room, what you processed and translated and filtered, and you wonder dimly why you are always so tired. That is not sensitivity. That is the cost of having hidden it so long that the hiding has become the first response. There is a layer beneath the management that the conversation about sensitivity almost never reaches. And it is this: the shame was not only about feeling too much. It was about what the feeling pointed to. High sensitivity is not just a matter of intensity. It is a matter of register. The highly sensitive person tends to perceive things that are actually there, relational dynamics, unspoken tensions, the quality of a silence, and to perceive them before they have been socially ratified as real. This creates a specific kind of loneliness that is not about being misunderstood in the ordinary sense. It is the loneliness of knowing something that cannot yet be named, of living in a permanent slight lag between what you have registered and what the room is prepared to acknowledge. What happens to a person who lives in that lag consistently for years? Something very specific. They learn to doubt the thing that is actually most reliable about them. Not because they are foolish. Because the doubt was rational, given the feedback they received. If the room consistently does not confirm what you are sensing, and if the room is your only reference point, then the sensible conclusion, the adaptive conclusion, is that your sensing is unreliable. You did not stop trusting your sensitivity because it failed you. You stopped trusting it because no one around you could confirm what you were receiving. This is the thing that the framing of sensitivity as gift entirely misses. It is not enough to tell someone their perception is valid. Because the problem is not that they stopped perceiving. They never stopped. The problem is that they built a layer of distrust on top of the perception, a second-order response that intercepts the signal before it can be acted on. And that layer, that learned reflexive distrust, is what actually costs them. Jung, writing about the introverted intuitive, described something he called the inferior function, the way in which the psyche's least developed capacity tends to create the greatest distortion. For someone whose orientation is primarily inward, the inferior function is often sensation, the direct, embodied, immediate contact with the outer world. What this means in practice is that the highly sensitive person can be exquisitely attuned to meaning and pattern and undercurrent, and simultaneously be strangely cut off from the simplest physical reality of their own experience. They can read the emotional temperature of a room with precision and not know whether they are hungry. They can feel the shape of someone else's grief before that person has spoken it aloud and not be able to locate their own. The outer world, the world of bodies, surfaces, immediate sensation, becomes, paradoxically, the most difficult terrain for the person most oriented toward depth. Taking this further than Jung stated directly, what this means is that the management of sensitivity is also, almost always, a management of the body. The closing of the aperture does not just happen at the cognitive level. It happens at the level of breath, of posture, of the specific muscular holding that develops over years in a nervous system that learned early to intercept its own responses. The person who has been containing their intensity for a long time has usually also developed a particular relationship to their own physical aliveness, one in which the body's signals are translated and filtered before they are felt, rather than felt and then responded to. The sensitivity is still there, but it is being processed through a system that has learned to manage it before it arrives. This is where the question opens that has never been put to you. What would be left if the management stopped? Not the sensitivity but the shame you built around it to make it survivable. Not the sensitivity, the shame. Because the sensitivity was always there. It did not go anywhere. It is happening right now as you watch this. You are taking this in at a register that is reading more than the words. What you built on top of it to make the exposure bearable is what you have mistaken for the problem. The management was never you. The management was what you constructed when you concluded, wrongly and understandably and very early, that you were not allowed to simply be what you were. If something in this is landing somewhere you have not let yourself go in a while, leave a word in the comments. One word. The word is depth. It is a signal to me that this reached you and a signal to yourself that you let it. The question of what remains when the management stops is not a therapeutic question. It is not asking you to do anything. It is asking you to recognize something. What remains is the original capacity, the thing that was there before the shame was added, before the management was built, before you learned to translate yourself into a frequency the room could receive. You have been solving the wrong problem. You treated the sensitivity as the thing that needed management. None of those efforts resolved anything, not really, because the thing that needed management was never the sensitivity. It was the shame that told you the sensitivity was dangerous. Shame is not static. It is activated by precisely the things that matter most to you, by the art that reaches you at a register you have been trained to consider embarrassing, by the conversations that go somewhere real where the familiar contraction says not yet, calibrate, by the moments of connection where your depth of feeling becomes visible. Every one of those moments is a new encounter with the old verdict. The most exhausting thing is not feeling deeply. It is feeling deeply and then immediately managing whether you are allowed to. Now name what becomes possible if the management stops. Not the management of sensitivity but the management of shame. If you were to locate the moment where the reflex fires, the calibration, the containment, the instant assessment of how much is too much, and instead of following the reflex you simply stayed in what you were actually feeling. Not performed it, not broadcast it, just did not intercept it. You would not become too much. You would become more present. There is a difference and it is enormous. Too much implies excess, something that spills past what the situation can hold. Presence implies contact. Real contact. The kind that actually reaches people, that lands in them differently than the calibrated version. The person who has been managing their sensitivity for 20 years tends to be extraordinarily good at a certain kind of connection. Warm, attentive, reliably attuned to what others need. But it is often a connection that moves in one direction. They receive at depth and they give what is safe, and the exchange has an asymmetry that both parties can feel but neither can fully name. What the other person sometimes says when the relationship is honest enough is, "I feel like I never quite know you." And the sensitive person hears this as confirmation of the original verdict, when what it actually is the cost of the management. The other person does not know you because you were hiding the most alive part of yourself, and you had convinced yourself you were doing them a favor. You were not doing them a favor. There is a way through it that has nothing to do with performing more openness, or announcing your depth. It has to do with the moment before all of that, where you feel the thing arrive and do not immediately move to manage it. Just for a breath. Just long enough to know it is real. That moment is where the work actually is. Not in the showing. In the not intercepting. The capacity you were born with is not damaged. It was never damaged. What happened to it happened to your relationship with it. And a relationship can change. You are not someone who feels too much. You are someone who was taught, very precisely, to believe that you did. And there is a version of you that existed before that teaching, and it has been here the entire time, doing the processing, reading the rooms, taking the drive home and feeling the full weight of everything. The sensitivity was never the wound. The shame was the wound. The sensitivity was what was there before it. That is the thing that needed to be said. What changes is the posture you have been holding. You have been the unreliable narrator of your own interior experience, not because your experience was unreliable, but because the reliability of it was never confirmed to you at the moment you most needed that confirmation. And the management has worked in a narrow sense. You have gotten through rooms and relationships and decades, but it cut you off from the primary texture of your own life. Jung wrote that individuation is not a process of acquiring something new but of recovering something always present and obscured. What gets obscured for the person who has been managing their sensitivity is not the feeling itself. The feeling never stopped. It is the legitimate claim to the feeling. The right to experience your own experience at the resolution it actually arrives in. The part of you that was never the problem is the part that feels everything. It was always the most reliable thing you had. The drive home. The processing in the dark. The specific exhaustion of having been present in a room at a register no one else was operating at. That was never dysfunction. That was the most attentive, most accurate, most honest thing about you, doing exactly what it was built to do, in a world that had not given you language for it or space for it or confirmation that it was real. You have the language now. You have had the confirmation. What you do with it is yours to decide. But you are no longer deciding from the premise that something was wrong with you. Because nothing was. Nothing ever was. The sensitivity is intact. It has been intact the entire time. And everything you built around it, the management, the translation, the calibrated disclosure, was not weakness. It was intelligence operating under false premises, doing its best with what it was given. You were given less than you deserved. That is worth acknowledging once clearly without softening it. And now you have something you did not have before. Not a solution. Not a practice. A different premise. One that does not require you to manage the most alive part of yourself as if it were a liability. One that lets you take the drive home without calling the processing a flaw. One that lets the beauty that reaches you actually arrive, without the immediate move to contain it. You are not too much. You were in a room that was too small. And you can leave now. The people who find their way to this channel are usually the ones who have always felt more than they were permitted to show. This channel is built for that. Stay here.